The grief load for children is great. More than 200,000 kids in the US lost a parent or primary caregiver as of last fall during the pandemic. Meanwhile, an estimated 8 million more children around the world suffered the death of a parent or a primary caregiver. And that's a lot of sorrow. That's a lot of sorrow by people who are quite vulnerable and haven't really had a chance to develop adequate tools so that they know how to manage their grief and how to experience and handle that experience that they're going through. And children's grief is often misunderstood. It's a prime reason why kids don't get an awful lot of support that they need. Consequently, generous support is often not offered to kids. We don't understand it. We think they act like they're fine and just the way they seem to be, and they're really hurting a lot inside and not sure what to do with a lot of stuff. And then when you take that and you look into communities that are so often underserved from the grief world, children who are Black or brown or from other marginalized groups, that social support is rapidly deteriorating. My guest here on Journeys Through Grief is Dr. Jillian Bluford. She is clinical assistant professor, the Department of Counseling Psychology at the University of Denver. And Jillian has spent many, many years with children. She joins us to talk about these kids and how communities can support them, providing tools for their living. Jillian, thank you so much for being with us here on Journeys Through Grief.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Great. We're talking about a group of kids who are underserved or marginalized. How are these terms defined? Basically, who are these kids that really are often alone in their grief?
Yeah, I think that this particular population and group of kids, represent a larger communities that have historically gone underserved based off of racial or ethnic identities, gender identities, social economic status, that, primary language of English or non-English. And so as a historical context have just, gone overlooked, have not had same access to healthcare providers, mental health providers. Oftentimes, these students, and I think if even students with developmental delays or learning disabilities, they're often also disciplined more often in schools, and and punished more in schools. And then we see that school to prison pipeline, and so while we're focusing on all these things that they're not, or risk factors, or all these things, we're overlooking that they are also grievers, and have endured tremendous losses, trauma, generational trauma, all things that could have taken place prior before they were even arrived on Earth. And so that's, when I think of who are we underserving, is typically the kids we're overlooking them, because we're noticing what we think are behavioral problems, when in actuality it can be their grief.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that's one of the things that really is misunderstood an awful lot, that, grief in kids, there's so much energy and things that oftentimes comes out in actions and activities and play and movements. Kids, I've heard it said, are very somatic grievers. They're really in their bodies with that. And so with all of this energy of grief, they just are moving around. And it is oftentimes, as you pointed out here, that they get punished for that. And nobody looks at their grief. And that's part of being that underserved. It's sort of like they're just sort of, come on, behave. And
right.
you can't, they're grieving.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes, yeah, we'll see like, why are they having these outbursts? Or why do they, why can't they focus in class? Or, you know, just yeah, any reactions you're like, huh, this is atypical. Uh, and then yeah, we try to look to solve what's the behavioral issue, like what's the academic concern, right?
Sure.
And you're right, we're not asking, are they grieving? Have they been through a traumatic experience? And you know, at the present time or in the past, right? Because grief doesn't end. And so, it's not that it's a new school year and we can forget all the losses that student
Right.
endured the year before. It's like that grief has carried on, right? Now maybe presenting in a different way.
Yeah, that's really important, I think, for teachers as well as for parents and things. So what kinds of losses and deaths often impact children in these communities? What are the kinds of things that they are dealing with? You've mentioned, some traumatic stuff and some pre-birth sorts of things. What kinds of stuff do they work with?
Yeah. So, like you mentioned before in the intro, the pandemic has highlighted a lot of disparities. Everyone has lost something or someone or multiple people during the pandemic,
Hmm.
but particularly for communities of color, communities that are underserved, COVID just hit a lot harder, right? So we have a lot of kids that are have lost one or both caregivers, right, and even extended family, right? Pandemic really hit our older individuals harder than a lot of other populations. And so,
Hmm.
if they were close to grandparents or older aunts and uncles or siblings, even
Sure.
a lot of that, that death related losses is a primary thing that's been going on in those communities. And then when I think of non-death losses, right, still tied to the pandemic, right, the routine change, their school settings change.
Hmm.
A lot of them were doing hybrid, but also in underserved communities, they didn't have all the resources, right, to have internet connections and laptops to like continue to engage in their curriculum. So that was a loss in itself. There can be oftentimes we see communities that are underserved, their kiddos in foster care more often. And so that's
Hmm.
a loss within itself of going maybe from one foster family to another, losing connection with your primary family system can be a loss in there. And then when thinking about the communities that they live in, right, if there is any type of safety concerns, if there has been historically any, violent acts within the communities, whether within the community members themselves or violent acts done to that community, that's a kind of generational trauma and losses that's kind of passed down that can oftentimes lead to a loss of like innocence, right?
Hmm.
Where we want children to be children, and but then children in these communities and with often excluded and marginalized identities don't get to keep their childhood for as long as other kids, right? They are often taught about how to interact with police, right, or things to look out for or safety concerns, or that the world may treat you differently based on just how you look, right? And so that's also ties into, well, okay, loss of identity, like how can I be my authentic self if I'm going into settings that don't value me, right?
Right.
And
Or
don't
don't
value
trust
people
me
who,
or whatever. Hmm.
right, yeah, and don't value people who look like me. And so that's also a loss of like relationship building, potential, future job opportunities and other activities and just things that like when you don't feel valued, that you're not going to pursue those things or
Right.
other, those opportunities won't be available to you. And so it's just so many different things within their systems that like are just loss after loss after loss. And sometimes
Hmm.
they don't even know. And like we as adults may not even realize that
Sure.
like that's a loss. We can just say like, oh, that's just how it is, right? That's
Yep.
how it's always been. And so, I need to prepare you for this world instead of taking a step back and saying, wow, this is unfortunate that you have to prepare for this type of world to navigate and live in. And that's a loss in itself, right? That others never had to think about.
Right. Right. One of the things you said earlier, and it really sparked a thought in my mind in particular about special needs kids or the
Mm-hmm.
special need community and things.
Yeah.
Oftentimes their birth concerns or whatever, however it's happening, everything creates such a need for a lot of support to support that child. So it's a
Mhm.
whole family thing. And then when the losses are of aunts, uncles, grandparents, you take a significant person out who not only supported that, but was offering literally hands-on care and things. That
Yes.
really does make things very, very difficult for the entire family, but also for the child that's grieving, because they're going to be grieving no matter what their involvement may be with their
Right.
with their concerns and things. And so, and how that all plays out. I love the way that you just really just rolled so many things in there, because grief does impact us in such a primary way within our being, that you
Yeah.
lose those supports and things. It
Mhm.
really is detrimental in a long-term kind of focused way.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It doesn't stop. Like you mentioned, we can have a primary loss and then secondary losses can come in over time, right? That again, that we're not connecting back to what was the loss that maybe initiated all of this. So if I had, a grandparent die, yeah,
sure.
you're right. I'm losing the physical relationship with that person. But yeah, that mental and emotional support,
Mhm.
that refugees of going to spend, the weekend at grandma's,
Right.
the ability for grandmother to share, family stories
Right.
and historical things, they just lose so much that like as they get older, we have this like regrief phenomenon that like, oh, now I'm a little bit
Mm.
older. Now I recognize more the gravity of that loss.
Yeah.
Right. And now I'm getting more milestones. I'm like, man, I really wish, that grandparent was here.
Right.
Right. Because I'm just missing that type of support. So yeah, the grief doesn't end and it can expand, right, as the student gets older.
Right. Right. I want to go back here a minute, because you used a word that I think is really important here, and I'd like you to sort of talk about what it means and everything. And that's re-grief. We don't
Mm,
think about that and stuff, but that really is a very powerful phenomenon.
yeah, yeah, and it's essentially, the younger we are when we experience a grief. Again, we understand that grief does not, or experience a loss. We understand that grief doesn't have a timeline.
Right.
And as we get older, we go through different developmental milestones, right, and stages, and our brains grow. We just understand more of the environment around us, people, ourselves. Um, and so when we hit those, stages and milestones, we think about, oh, okay, now I understand the gravity of this loss, or I recognize more that this person or a group of people is not here. And this can kind of hit. I think about if a young kid loses a mother, right, and then they get older and go through high school. Oh man,
Hmm.
mom is not here for homecoming, for prom, for
Right.
graduation, right? Then maybe I decide to get married, right, or I want to start my own family. um, and things that you expect that mother figure to be there for, right, is not there for whatever reason, right? Mom could physically not be here or not in the picture, right? And it still doesn't really stop that regrief phenomenon. So sometimes we can get to that next developmental milestone and stage, recognize the loss, and then our old grief responses, right, our initial grief responses can start to return.
Sure.
And then that also will throw a lot of people off because you're like, wait, what happened? Like, this is, you haven't responded this way to your loss in years.
Right. I thought I
Well,
was done. I thought it was over.
right, right.
Mhm.
But
Sure.
now it's like, oh, but now I'm at, again, a different point in my life where, again, I can understand it more and it hits more because it's not just like, oh, I'm younger and like, yeah, I experience a lot of my grief and express it through play. And, it's fleeting at times. I'm now older where my grief can stick with me for months, for days, for time, for
Yeah.
years, and really start to impact, my present world then.
Right, right. Thank you. I think that's really important, and really important for us to see. And one of the things that I hear a lot, and wanted to ask you about your experience with it, is that so often when like a parent or a sibling dies,
Mm,
um, kids get kids of all ages get subjected, I think it's the word I want to use, to some not so helpful and very supportive kinds of statements and things. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if you might share some of those, and also what you encourage when you're working with kids that have heard these things, how to work through them, how to move past those things.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, I hear from my own professional experience and like just statements that kids have shared to me, and it's all well intended, but
Sure.
statements that time, you'll get better with time, right?
Hmm.
Or the time will heal all wounds. Sometimes there are a lot of statements that can connect to one's religious beliefs, like
Hmm.
they're no longer in pain, or they're with God right now, and not to say that to don't say those, right? If that's beliefs that is shared within the family household and is supportive, and part of that kid's culture, right? Then sure, and also understand that like that doesn't remove the pain that kid is feeling, right? Like I can believe that this person is no longer in pain and still really wish that they were still here, right? And wish that I had them back, right? And it's not a and or. Um, Sometimes I'll hear, especially for and really for any kid, especially in these communities, that you're now the man of the house,
Hmm.
right? Or now you're the oldest sibling, or something that implies that you have to take on added responsibilities
Right.
and you have new roles, and that's not fair to the kid, right? Like they did not ask for this, and so
Sure.
have this underlying pressure that I need to be like fill the shoes of someone who could have been a significant role in that family system.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's not fair, and it takes away again the loss of that childhood. Like now I feel like I need to grow up and be 10 years older than what I am because I need to be the man of the house, right? Or the
Yep.
leader of the house. So oftentimes I'll hear that, and not so much of a statement, but just of the, well, they're playing with their friends again. They seem to be doing okay in school, and so their grief is gone, right?
Yep.
And so then we don't talk about the person or people, and we don't check in, right? And so part of my biggest encouragement is to resist the urge to fix this kid's grief, to make them feel better, right? It's not your responsibility, right? Adult's responsibility to make things better, but rather to listen, to validate, to share their own right grief, and
Hmm.
allow the kids to also see you grieving. Right. Sometimes we feel like I don't want to upset kids more, and so I'll cry or I'll express my grief, in silence, right? And then I'll put on a
Sure.
brave face, and so then they get the message. Oh well, I can't cry. I can't talk
Yep.
about this person because I don't want to upset. And everyone is trying not to upset anyone else. But in
Right. Hmm.
reality, if we can be vulnerable and share that this is tough, then we know we're not alone, right? Because grief can
Right.
feel isolating, right? Especially as time goes on, because you think that everyone else has kind of just moved on, but you haven't, right? But everyone else also feels the same way. Of like, man,
Right.
everyone's back to normal, and I'm not. When really we need to recognize that like who we were before the loss is gone,
Yeah.
right? And now we're a new person. So being authentic, right? And leaving the door open for kids to ask questions, to talk about the person if that makes them, you know, um, express their grief in a way that works for them, right? Which is can be hard, right?
Right.
Because it's, we're not, we can have conversations where we remember the person and we have great memories and we laugh, and again moments that we are really sad and maybe depressed and really are angry, right, that the person is no longer here, and that's all grief, right? We don't, again, it
Yep.
doesn't, um, it's not a this or that, right? It's a complex experience that we have.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that in talking about here, we watch one
Hmm.
another to learn how to grieve.
Yep.
So much of how we in families and things learn to grieve is by watching, our parents. I
Yeah.
still have this really powerful memory of my dad when my grandmother died. And we were standing around after the church service, getting ready to go to the cemetery for the graveside service. And I mean, clear as day, I see my dad standing there, and just the sorrow and sadness in the whole of his body. And we pick those things up so easily, and especially as children. I was 9 when that happened, and or 11, and just really, it just really does stick powerfully with us.
Right.
And if we are taught to, as I say, the stiff upper lip and be tough and don't grieve, and you don't let any of the feelings out and stuff, and you just move forward, move on, and and be tough with it, and everything, that is really so antithetical to what we need to do, and yet so many of us have learned that. So my question to you is, for people who've been taught that, how can they move beyond it? Like for their kids, or what are things that they can do to develop new ways of grief for their own selves, so that they're not wrestling with the 800-pound, the 2,000-pound pink elephant that's in the room that nobody ever wants to talk about, because somebody may cry, or we all may have some bad feelings or something. How can these people then, what can they do? What can you suggest that they do to be able to wrestle and engage with this in a new way and begin to learn something new with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because what we model to kids is what they're going to internalize and then repeat, because they think that that's the norm. And so I would encourage adults, it has to start with us, right? Think about your ways of expressing grief, talking about losses or not, right? And from a place of non-judgment, right? Like, do what the best we know how to do, right? Until we learn something better, right? And then hopefully we can then grow and develop in that way. And if you don't have it, find your support systems, right? And whether that's connecting with others, that's not your kid, right? Sometimes we easily parentify kids, right? We let them into it's one thing to be open and authentic with their grief, and then there's another thing to bring up a lot of other things. So, like, again, we want to be developmentally appropriate, and so finding your village, right, your group of individuals, whether that's personal things at local spiritual centers, at therapy, right, and find a way to be okay with being vulnerable with these select people. Right? Because it's oftentimes we kind of get this impression, especially in underserved communities, we have the notion like no one's here to help us anyway, or I've tried to get help and it hasn't worked. And so I'm going to keep with, to myself, or maybe within a small group of people. And I would say to try again, right? Find community members that represent your identities, right? Because when we can be vulnerable, when we can, like you said, get this 2,000-pound, just baggage, right, off of us, it doesn't fix it, right? It's not like you're not going to feel better permanently, but the heaviness begins to offset a little bit, right? And we can put it where it needs to be, and not onto our families, not onto other people, right? And live with some peace that we all deserve. And so then when we have that baggage and kind of that filter of like this heaviness of grief start to lighten up some, then we can recognize and empathize with other people, right? We can have conversations with kids. Again, we can answer questions developmentally appropriately, and not feel our own stuff coming up.
Right.
And so it really does start with us, right? And we can be open with kids of, I'm working through my own stuff too. I'm not perfect. And the ways that I have tried to express grief, and just talking about what grief is, right? Sometimes kids, we don't learn what that is. Like, we don't have a name for it. And so just giving it something like, oh, it's not just me, right? Like there's nothing wrong with me, right? I've experienced a loss or a lot of losses, and that's
Right.
altering how I'm developing and how I view the world, right? And so how do we do this as a community together, right? And really do some healing that's definitely needed within a lot of underserved communities.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Are there, some simple kinds of things or resources that you know of that people could seek out that are out there that would be helpful for them or to do
Yeah.
some of that or to offer to their kids?
Yeah, I have a couple organizations that come in mind. One, and all these organizations provide resources for grieving children and their families. A lot of the resources are provided in multiple languages, um, and I like that these resources can also provide, what to expect as an adult working and supporting a grieving child, right? And again, what's developmentally appropriate, and when
Mhm.
may you say, okay, maybe I do need some other external resources, or this is their grief, right? And I need to be patient with them and meet them where they are. Um, so the first one is Judy's House for Grieving Children and Families. Their center is based here in near Denver, Colorado.
Mhm.
But they have done a lot of research. They have a lot of trainings and webinars and book resources. I
Right.
oftentimes will recommend books because it's one, they can be animated and they can provide a character that can help grieving children say like, oh, maybe I'm not ready to internalize that to me, but like I can read a book and see how they're navigating their
Sure.
losses, right, and going
Sure.
through things. And so yeah, provide a lot of things. If folks ever find themselves in the Denver area, they also provide free support groups for
Okay.
children and for their caregivers. The Dougie Center, right?
Yep.
It's kind of,
Good.
it's super primal in starting kind of this whole framework of working with grieving children and families
Mhm.
in the communities, and have also a ton of resources available online. The Coalition to Support Grieving Students, they
Sure.
have some great resources and trainings, and also, once you as a caregiver have really better understood, your child's grief and their losses, you want to make sure that their school setting
Yes.
is also keeping this in mind, accommodating when need to, and you have that communication. So the Coalition to Support Grieving Students also has trainings and modules for professionals in the school setting,
Yep.
right, that can be helpful. And then the National Alliance for Grieving Children, they also have great resources and like really concrete things about how to talk about death
Yes.
with
Good.
grieving youth.
Mhm.
And again, in different, a couple different languages. In all these resources have a cultural lens in mind, that know that, like, again,
Mhm.
kids in this community may have endured additional more challenging losses, right? And so how do we be culturally sensitive and culturally humble when engaging with this, knowing that, we're gonna have conversations about, again, religion and spirituality beliefs and death-related rituals and all those things, and how are we making sure we're not pushing a westernized um, framework on that.
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
those resources are really helpful. Also, a lot of different cities and areas, if there's a local hospice center, um, typically they have bereavement centers that are available to the communities, regardless if you had a loved one, utilize their hospice services. Those can be really helpful as well, right? And again, and primarily all of the organizations that I mentioned, and even local hospice bereavement centers, will provide those services for free.
Yep. Good.
And so that can be a great way to make sure that cost isn't a barrier.
Right. Right. That's wonderful, Jillian. Thank you. All particularly the first ones that you mentioned, and all are ones that I'm familiar with, and we will put those links to
Yeah,
those in the chat box here so that people can
great.
can connect with those as well. Those are outstanding and wonderful.
Um,
Um, this has been just so rich and so helpful. And I really, really enjoyed the conversation that we've had. I do want to thank each person who has joined us here, be it in real time, or if you are watching this at some other time in the future. We hope that you found something that will help you to feel a bit more strong. First, as you wrestle with your grief, and secondly, as you seek to support, children in your family or in your neighborhood and community. That's one of the ways that we are going to grow a more healthy society, and all, as if we can really learn to get a handle on our grief and at least just understand it, which is why we call these Understanding Grief. My thanks to Jessica for monitoring our feed and our page, and I invite everybody to follow us on Facebook so that we can be together through your journey through grief. And Jillian, again, thank you so very much for your time, for your expertise, and all that you've offered. You are a great wealth of wisdom, which we really, really appreciate.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, we are sending everyone peace as you grieve your loss.